Okay, well, it looks like we are live on Facebook. So, you all set, Janet?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Hannah, and I am a board member with the Friends of Haystack Rock here in beautiful Cannon Beach, Oregon. I am so excited to welcome you all to our very first library lecture series speaker for this year. Our World of Haystack Rock session is always a very fun opportunity to get to learn more about our natural wildlife and our local area. And whether you're tuning in from Cannon Beach or you're tuning in from somewhere else, we're so glad to have you here to learn more about the amazing ecosystem and location that some of us are lucky to live in, and many wonderful people are come out and visit. So thank you so much. And before we get started, we do have a great speaker. I'm really excited to listen to your talk, Janet. But first off, if you guys do have any questions as we're going along on Facebook Live, go ahead and just mention those in the chat, and one of us will try to ask those questions for you so you get those answered. If not, we can arrange to do that at the end as well. So thank you all for joining us. And if you have questions, drop them in the chat. So Janet Essley is a painter, muralist, and teaching artist with over 20 years of experience creating collaborative murals with youth and adults. She has led collaborative murals for schools, colleges, community service groups, churches, at-risk youth programs, and environmental education projects. She believes that collaborative murals are a fundamental integration of art and communication with the practice of democracy. Her personal work is often focused on environmental issues. The cultural cartography of red knots is her most recent project. So thank you, Janet, for joining us. I'm going to get this PowerPoint going and we'll share that.
Thank you, Tiffany and Hannah, for inviting me out. It's always a pleasure to be on the coast, even if it's only in spirit. I'm going to be showing you tonight a series of paintings that I've made over the last 8 years. I view it as my contribution to the kind of conservation work and public education that groups such as yours are doing. It is very essential work for the future of all beings on the planet, and I hope that these paintings affirm your efforts and perhaps inspire some more people to join you. We're going to go to see a whole bunch of tidal flats around the world, and those chosen as preferred sites by one species of shorebird, Calidris canutus, known as the red knot, as places to go during the year. Now, red knots are sandpipers. They are not flamboyant and interesting like puffins or flamingos or other sorts of things. So to help you remember them in the future, we've got a few key phrases here about them: Victorian prudes, dark chocolate, and going to the moon. So this is what you're going to see, and let's get started. Next slide. There we go. So sandpipers and red knots are very social animals, and as shorebirds, they live in large groups along the tidal flats, the ocean shoreline. But once a year, they go to the Arctic and suddenly become Victorian prudes. They pair up with single pairs with nesting sites and territories far apart from each other for the short Arctic summer. In 30 days, the mating pairs meet, they make a nest, they lay eggs, they incubate the eggs, and after 30 days, the female, who's used up to 50% of her body mass laying the eggs, leaves the Arctic to refuel her body. So the male, in a very sort of un-Victorian fashion, is the one that raises the chicks. And then in another short 30 days, the chicks grow to their adult size. They grow flight feathers, eating insects all the time, and they walk potentially miles from their upland nesting sites in the tundra around a variety of predators and other obstacles in the Arctic until they reach the shore and to begin their first southern migration flight. This painting, mimicking a wool and fur embroidered wall hanging that is a style of art adapted by Inuit peoples of the Canadian Arctic, who now live in square-roomed, flat-walled houses, locates us in the Canadian Arctic, as I said. And the birds that have nested here will migrate down the Atlantic coast of the Americas, potentially all the way to Tierra del Fuego. Next slide. The Victorian prudes of France in the early 1800s are the ones that funded his studies, the studies of John James Audubon in his Birds of North America. The red knots that are, sorry, lost my train of thought there. Because we have a style of John James Audubon, who was a resident of Pennsylvania, this painting locates us near Delaware Bay, one of the major migration stopover points of red knots and a variety of other migrating birds on the Atlantic coast. The redbird in breeding plumage is an adult. Both sexes have the same breeding plumage, but that bird in a breeding plumage at Delaware Bay would be a bird that is passing through the bay in May. The bird lower down in non-breeding plumage of a juvenile would be a bird that has begun its first southern migration flight and might be passing through Delaware Bay in September. Why are the birds coming to Delaware Bay? They're coming there because it is an important breeding site for horseshoe crabs who come onto the tidal flats of the bay on the high tides of the spring to lay their eggs. And they potentially lay tons of eggs, which thousands of migrating shorebirds come in to eat. Now, their eggs are also sources of food for turtles and a variety of fish and other beings around the littoral zone of the ocean. So they are a keystone species for many, many beings besides red knots that live along our shores. They have been used for many things by people over the years, and one of the recent uses of them is in the biomedical industry because a factor in their blood is a toxin detector. So for the last 40 or 50 years, all the medical equipment and vaccines that you or I have received has been tested for purity with horseshoe crab blood. So when the COVID vaccine comes out, know that you are deeply connected, as are red knots, to horseshoe crabs. Next slide. Birds that are migrating along the coast of the Americas will stop in Delaware Bay in North America, but in South America, one of their famous bays that they stop at is the bays of San Antonio Oeste in Argentina. The conservationists in San Antonio Oeste have chosen as their mascot, much like Smokey the Bear, their mascot for public education is Fabian the red knot. They chose Fabian because the early days of airmail service to San Antonio Oeste, one of the people who pioneered that was the pilot Saint Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And he wrote a novel about those early airmail flights in Argentina. The hero pilot of one of them is Fabian. So Fabian the red knot now goes around San Antonio Oeste teaching people to keep their dogs leashed when they're on the beach during the bird migration season so as not to disturb the birds while they are foraging. Some of you may remember that Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is also the author illustrator of the book The Little Prince. In The Little Prince, when he left his planet, he attached himself with a series of cords to a flock of migrating birds. And so you see here the Little Prince in a moon-sized planet, a dog unleashed on the beach that has disturbed a flock of migrating birds. When birds are migrating, their fuel needs are so great that any time they are not foraging when possible, it reduces their capacity for the long migration flights that they make. The Little Prince attached himself to a flock of migrating birds via cords. Biologists attach themselves to flocks of migrating birds in other ways. Audubon pioneered the banding of birds in the early 1800s, and it was a banded bird from Argentina who was given the number B95, who was tracked by biologists seeing his leg bands at various places along his migration route for the next 20 years, which means that in that time he had accumulated enough flight miles to get to the Arctic, going to the moon, get to the moon and back. And I realized, although I have mentioned the Victorian prudes and now going to the moon, could we go back one slide, Hannah? Yes, to here, I forgot about the dark chocolate, and that is that the horseshoe crab eggs that are laid in the tons on the shores of Delaware Bay are dark chocolate to red knots. Red knots are a selective molluscivore. They have the largest gizzard of any of the shorebirds relative to their size that is used to grind up mollusk shells, which is the basics of their diet. But when they get to Delaware Bay, they switch to horseshoe crab eggs. Now, to help those of us who are not selective molluscivores understand this, it would be the difference if, as a chocolate lover, you spent most of the year eating Tootsie Roll Pops and you got to Delaware Bay and there was a lot of dark chocolate truffles with dark centers. What would you choose? So that's the dark chocolate portion that you need to remember about red knots. Okay, then back down to San Antonio Oeste, the next slide, we find the red knots being able to fly potentially as many flight miles as going to the moon. Next slide. Other ways that biologists have of attaching themselves to flocks of migrating birds is through the use of geolocators and other tracking devices that the technology is now small enough that they actually can fit on the birds without harming their ability to migrate. And from this, they've been able to learn that red knots are indeed making nonstop migration flights, 4 days, 6 days, 8 days in the air nonstop from one place to another. They accomplish this by reducing all unnecessary baggage before they take flight. They reduce the size of their internal organs and even the muscles in their legs, and so that all available space is left for the fat which they use as fuel. In flight, they shed excess heat through their legs. They get water through the metabolism of fat. And until recently, it was thought by biologists that they slept during flight in a process of unihemispheric slow brain waves, half the brain asleep at a time while the other half stayed alert. But because of those tiny tracking devices that biologists now can attach to birds to study brain waves, they now believe that all the birds are staying awake and alert in flight, even for 6 to 8 days, an astounding feat. So that's a little bit about red knots. We're now going to go see some of the tidal flats that they inhabit throughout the year. Next slide. The red knots that we saw that have bred in the Canadian Arctic, that use Delaware Bay and as a stopover point, might spend the rest of the year on the southern coast of the United States, the Gulf Coast, and the barrier islands of Texas, referenced here in the loopy landscape tile of American regional artist Thomas Hart Benton. They've become social animals again on the tidal flats, and not only do red knots live with large groups of other red knots, but with a variety of other shorebirds and resident birds along the coast. As you probably all know, the differences in bill size and length allows red knots, or allows the different shorebirds to all forage on a mud flat, but different birds are looking for different food resources, so they're not in direct competition with each other. In this picture, the plover has got the dark chocolate gummy worm, and the red knots are still looking for Tootsie Roll Pops and other forms of mollusks in the tidal flats. Next slide. The red knots that go down the Pacific coast of the United States will likely fly from their migration staging ground on the Yukon Delta straight down the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico, which is why we don't see a lot of them on the Oregon coast in the fall. In the pictographic style of cave paintings of Baja, you have birds, sea turtles, rabbits, whales, mountain sheep, and a subspecies of American antelope, identifying this site as the Vizcaíno Biodiversity Reserve near Guerrero Negro, Baja. As you know, along the coast, what happens on the interior affects the littoral zone and what the shoreline, and that affects the marine reserve. So all these three habitats support each other, and the Vizcaíno Biodiversity Reserve is one place where conservationists are working hard to help educate the public about that. It is home to a third of the non-breeding red knots of the Pacific coast, also to short-billed dowagers and marbled godwits, and is home to breeding sea turtles. Many of you know it as a place where friendly gray whales can go and be petted. Any of you have been there have maybe seen the huge salt piles of the salt export plant at Guerrero Negro, and it was those salt piles that inspired the natural history theme of this painting, when you can see the little salt piles on the bottom. There's not a lot of fresh water on the surface of the shoreline of Baja, and red knots and other shorebirds deal with excess salt in their blood by an organ in their forehead, which eliminates excess salt. It drips down a groove in their beak, and I have shown it here dripping into a microscopic pile of salt on the sand. Next slide. Another important estuary in Baja is at the mouth of the much abused Colorado River, which drains into the Sea of Cortez. Mexican conservationists have been doing wonderful habitat restoration work there for the many resident species that live in the estuary and the mangroves around it, but it is also home to the first-year-old red knots, those born in the Arctic on 1 year that have migrated down to Baja or to Padre Island, their southern range, wherever that is. They do not reach sexual maturity their first year. So when the adults leave to go back to the Arctic, those first-year-old red knots in their dull non-breeding plumage will stay in their most southern habitat, wherever that is. And this references the estuary, a major place for those non-breeding red knots on the north end of the Sea of Cortez. Now, a Pacific coast form of dark chocolate is grunion eggs that the Pacific coast Rosalari subspecies of red knots also eat. Next slide. The farthest south in the Americas that red knots of the Americas go is Tierra del Fuego. It was not known until the end of the 70s that they were here. Biologists who had studied red knots in Delaware Bay and along the southern coast of the United States knew that there was more birds passing through Delaware Bay than were spending the winter, their long summer, our winter, in along the southern coast of the United States. They didn't know where the rest went. So eventually some biologists got in a very small fixed wing airplane and essentially flew down the Argentinian coast, just a little bit above the ground level, looking for flocks of migrating red knots, and they eventually found them in the huge tidal flats of the Straits of Magellan. They were able to then go back many years in the 80s and the 90s to establish population base counts for the Rufa red knot subspecies that spent their long summer in Tierra del Fuego, and then in the early 2000s the whole population crashed, and that is shown in this painting with the muted birds coming in on the left, the one sort of realistically painted red knot in the center, and the red ovals leaving on a north migration flight on the right. The broad stripes and the oval shapes, dots and oval shapes of this painting are derived from the body painting of the Selknam people, the original inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego. The last of the Selknam people died, became extinct in the 1970s, and it is work by conservation groups such as yours that will mean that neither we nor they, the red knots, will become extinct in the near future. Next slide. So we're going to pop across with the next slide, pop across the Atlantic to the western coast of Africa, where the subspecies Canutus spends its long summer along the African coast. Now, as in the situation with Tierra del Fuego, the large breeding flocks of birds in South Africa have been dwindling over the last years, so the majority of the population is farther up the coast of Africa. The Kente cloth style a painting mimicking the strip weaving of Kente cloth locates us in Ghana. 10% of Ghana's land base is shoreland, tidal wetlands and what do I want to say? What is it called? Wetland shore, coastal wetlands. That's what it is. And this painting references feeding choices that red knots are making. They roost in large groups. That's shown up in the left corner. At high tide, when the tide goes out, different groups of birds choose to go to different beaches for foraging. They seem to know, or at least have decided, that the amount of energy that it takes to get to a beach, the potential energy of predators that may live at that beach, avoiding those predators, relative to the amount of energy that can be secured from the types of mollusks that are at their beach. That's an assessment that different flocks of birds make for their decisions to where they're going to forage during the day. So in the upper right corner, you have the birds with the upward wing going to the left, the birds with the downward wing going to the right. In the lower right-hand corner, you have birds foraging in the tidal flats. Red knots have 3 different foraging strategies. If they can see prey on the surface, they just pick it up. If it's tidal flats with lots of mud, and they do random pecking in the mud to find prey. And they also, as shown in the center square, have a organ at the end of their bills, the corpuscle, with which they can sense differences in water pressure in the mud that can lead them to prey that can't be seen. In the lower left-hand corner, they're making their flights in different direction back to the roosting site up at the top. So they're making important choices for how to get food. One of the upstream, the land issues of the coast of Ghana is how to develop that for agriculture, for human food. Traditional methods of agriculture are not a danger to the coastal lagoons of Ghana and other places in Africa, but industrial agriculture can be. So red knots make choices for food, and humans make choices for food. Next slide. Another choice that the red knots have to make during the year, shown in the lower right side of this painting, is they have to molt their flight feathers. They do this one at a time, one primary feather, one secondary feather at a time, and they cannot continue migration flights until all the feathers have been replaced. So on their southern migration from the Arctic to wherever they're going to spend the rest of the year, if they have time to get to their preferred spot, they fly directly to the preferred spot and then molt their flight feathers. If for whatever reason, timing leaving the Arctic, etc., they are unable to reach their preferred spot, they may stop and molt their flight feathers and then continue on. Now, this painting that is mimics a group of calabashes, incised gourds that you can see at the tourist markets of West Africa, locates us off the coast of Guinea-Bissau in what's called the Bajagos Archipelago. It is an astounding place of 80 islands that is home to millions of migrating and breeding birds. It is also the marine area around the islands is nursery ground for endangered hammerhead sharks. Some of the islands' beaches are nesting grounds for endangered sea turtle, 5 species of endangered sea turtles. And it is also the only known place for marine hippopotamuses. Who knew? Um, there are many amazing things like the existence of marine hippopotamuses that you can learn if you study red knots. So the reason that all this amazing habitat exists right now in the Bajagos archipelago is that the humans of the archipelago have declared that only a few of the islands are for human habitation. The rest have been sacred sites throughout traditional culture. That has allowed the islands to remain this amazing place for biodiversity. It is a marine reserve, it is a Ramsar important wetland site, and it has been nominated because of the unique human culture to be a UN World Heritage Site. In it, that I find ironic because it is what has protected the islands for so long is the human culture that lives there. Now, the proposed economic development for that area is ecotourism. And that, as all of us who live in tourist towns know, can be a double-edged sword. While tourists bring in money, they also bring in cameras and the internet and needs for this, that, and the other thing that can entice Bajagos youth away from what is a rather rigorous traditional culture. But anyway, what a wonderful place with marine hippopotamuses. Next slide. Thank you, Red Nuts, for finding it. All of us are aware of the importance of childhood nutrition. Now, this painting, using designs from architecture, henna hand decoration, and leatherwork designs of Mauritania, locates us in the extensive tidal flats of the Bangtagin off the coast. And studies there have shown this important relationship for red knots in early childhood nutrition. Red knots that spend their first, from hatching to flying, their first 30 days in the Arctic, if for whatever reason in those 30 days they do not have primo insect resources to eat, will have smaller bodies and shorter bills than birds that have had greater resources in their first weeks of life. When they get to the place where they spend most of the year, their bills may not be long enough to reach down into the mud to get to the nutritious bivalve resources that they're after, shown here by all the little colorful dots. If they cannot get to those mollusk resources with high protein content, what they will be eating is the roots and seeds of seed grasses. Because, as we saw earlier, the red knots don't go to the Arctic again to breed for their first couple of years. They are going to be eating this vegan diet. They are not going to be getting any bigger. They've reached adult size, and they may not be able, when it is time to migrate, to get the protein and fat-rich foods that they need to have enough fuel to make it up to the Arctic on their migration flight. So what happens to the birds on one part of their migration cycle affects everything else, as we know, and as the kind of work that you do helps people to know that everything is all connected. Now we're going to take a quick trip over in the next slide over to the Pacific Ocean, where those birds that breed in the eastern Russian Arctic. We got the next slide. There we go. Breed in the eastern Russian Arctic are going to go down the East Asian flyway on the coast of the Pacific to as far south as New Zealand. So in a contemporary Maori style, you have here a synchronous flock of stylized red knots in their non-breeding plumage, leaving the mangrove channel on the left. New Zealand only gets 3 species of migrating birds: the knots, red knots, 2 different species of sandpipers, and Hudsonian bar-tailed godwits. Many of you probably know that this year a bar-tailed godwit attached to scientists with one of those geolocators was tracked on an 11-day nonstop flight, 7,500 miles from the coast of Alaska down to New Zealand. So an amazing feat for such a little being. Birds that come to the tidal flats and estuaries of New Zealand belong to the subspecies rogersii, and some of them may also be spending the long summer, because it's summer in Australia, in New Zealand between October and April. On the west coast, the rogersii subspecies goes to the east coast of Australia, and the piersma subspecies goes to the west coast. Next slide. Where they're going to spend their long summer in diverse flocks of migrating and resident birds, especially in a tidal flat known as Roebuck Bay, where they are going to be eating a variety of different mollusks, different birds being able to get down to different prey depending on the size and shape of their beaks. So here we have whimbrel and godwit and stilt, oystercatcher, and red knots. Now the biologist who introduced me to this whole project said, when you do Roebuck Bay, you got to put in the mud skippers, which are those 2 little fishy things in the center. They are walking fish that can breathe air as well as having gills, and are that transition of marine life to inhabit our terrestrial spaces. Red knots, as I said, will spend the long summer here. When it gets to be time for them to migrate, next slide, they will atrophy their internal organs, shown here in a X-ray style of Aboriginal dot painting, and they prefer to migrate, begin their migration flights on the full moon, which you can see reflected in the ocean here, and on the high tide when the mangrove channels are full of water. When that time comes, and this Aboriginal style of dot painting reminds us that all we are really is a bunch of very widely separated vibrating atoms. When flocks of red knots do it, next slide, they will call to each other on the beach and get all excited and eventually gather together in these large swirling masses that go round and round till they get high enough to achieve flight altitude, and then will line out in V's or echelons so that a bird can get a little more uplift drafting off the bird in front of it. This again is red knots beginning a migration flight on the full moon that you can see reflected in the water. The concentric circles and bright colors and very odd shapes in this painting come from an anthropophagus style of art that locates us in Brazil, particularly here in the Lagoa Pexé of southern Brazil. This is a huge lagoon, shallow lagoon along the Atlantic coast. It has been named a important wetland habitat for migrating birds. It is threatened by the current federal economic and political decisions of the federal government of Brazil that the Amazon habitat is basically irrelevant, and so cutting it down for agriculture or ranches or other things is no problem. So choices that people make about their agriculture as birds make about their foraging sites. Lagoa Pexe is one of places where the red knots of the rufous subspecies that use that go up the Atlantic coast of the Americas may decide to make a choice of their migration route. Some of them may just make a direct jump over the Amazon basin, a simple 4-day nonstop flight till they get to the southern coast, the Gulf Coast of the United States, or some of them may continue up the the Atlantic coast till they round the tip of South America at the mouth of the Amazon and have a straight shot up the Caribbean and Atlantic to Delaware Bay. On their southern migration, next slide, those same red knots may choose, after spreading out in their Victorian pairs through the Arctic, to come back together to get ready for a migration flight at the south end of Hudson Bay in an area known as James Bay. The young of the year here are switching from an insect diet, growing gizzards and learning how to eat mollusks. Before making that flight, they have to get enough fat reserves to be able to do the flight. Those birds that are staging in James Bay are likely to hop down to the coast of New England and continue down the Atlantic coast for their September migration. James Bay is another place where decisions made about upstream habitat can affect the salinity and the biochemistry of the bay. There's lots of hydro dams upstream, reducing freshwater flow into the bay, and mining, pollution going into the bay, both of which salinity and biochemistry may affect the invertebrate populations of the bay, and therefore its resource for migrating birds. Other birds from the central Canadian Arctic, next slide, are going to choose a different route. They're going to fly to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in a place called the Mingan Archipelago, the tidal flats around these many uninhabited rocky structures, and go from there, making a direct flight over the Atlantic to the mouth of the Amazon River. They are choosing the Atlantic route in hurricane season, and at least one red knot has been tracked as leaving the Mingan Archipelago and flying for 6 days nonstop, being taken 600 miles out of his way, somehow re-navigating to figure out where he was in the Atlantic Ocean, and headed back towards South America, but having to make an emergency stop in the Caribbean in order to refuel for the other places on his southern flight. Back to those Victorian prudes, they're very difficult to find in the Arctic because their nests are so far apart and also well camouflaged. So it has been very difficult for scientists to trying to find nests in the Arctic tundra to understand the success of breeding populations in any given year. But they have realized that they can forecast this by the arrival of the birds in the Mingan Archipelago. The females, as I said before, leave the Arctic as soon as the chicks are born. And so the yellow-bellied one in the right-hand side has those 4 empty eggs in her body. The male has the blue belly in the middle, and the young of the year is coming behind with the greenish belly. Now, if the scientists in the Mingan Archipelago in August and September find that the females have arrived without many males, and that the males arrive 30 days later, it's a good indication that there was a reason for the males to stay in the Arctic, because they were busy raising chicks. Now, both the last painting in James Bay and this painting in the Mingan Archipelago are done in a painting style of a contemporary Quebec First Nations artist, Norval Morisseau. Birds that are breeding in the Canadian Arctic that you see here have chosen sites west of Hudson Bay. Next slide. Those birds that are breeding in the Canadian Arctic east of Hudson Bay on Baffin Island and in northern Greenland are going to be making migration stops in Iceland on the way to their long summer home on the North Sea of Europe. There are Viking legends that after they had discovered Greenland, in order to navigate there, especially when there was no celestial cues, they were actually using flights of migrating birds, shown here, to guide them to Iceland. Though that navigating by the stars and the sky is a skill that many humans have had, and we've all lost, except perhaps for the great Hawaiian navigators. But as the future comes, it may be skills we would like to have again sometime. Next slide. I mentioned that the red knots that migrate through Iceland from Greenland and Canada, called the Icelandic subspecies of red knots, choose to spend their long summer, October through April months, along the North Sea coast above the British Isles and in the Wadden Sea, which is north of Holland. We may not think that the North Sea is a great place to spend summer holidays, but the Icelandic subspecies of red knots has made that energy calculation that there is enough food available, digestible, and with enough protein and fat in it that they can survive the winter, even though there is less light and therefore less time for foraging. They will also have enough, be able to store enough fat and energy in order to make the migration flight to the Canadian Arctic in the spring, having enough energy left over to wait, if they get there before the snow melts and there's insect food, that they have the resources stored within their body to survive. They have chosen not to migrate to the southern end of the planet, as have Rufous subspecies in Tierra del Fuego, or the birds that go to New Zealand or South Africa. So that weighing of choices is something that the birds do, and that we are increasingly being called upon to do with our resources. Now, Little Holland, as you all know, has made the choice to put dikes up to deal with its low elevation below sea level. They've also are the vegetable garden of Europe. So this tiny little place is supplying vegetables to much of Europe. And how do they do that? They have chosen to do agriculture in greenhouses. Now they sacrifice their night sky for that, but they've also been able to save land and rehabilitate land that they call the meadowlands as habitat for a variety of breeding birds and migrants, including the redknots, which are being dispersed by a peregrine falcon in the middle ground of this painting, and a variety of shorebirds, dunlins, and redshanks, and plovers, and then oyster catchers in the foreground. Closer to home, next slide, we come to a place known to us, I hope, by the Northwest Coast style of art here. This is locating us in Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay, just south of the Quinault Reservation on the coast of Washington. Although redknots were not an iconic species in traditional Northwest culture, the clam, salmon, and otter shown in the sky of this picture above the two redknots were. This painting references the important concept of redknot behavior, which is site fidelity. Migrating flocks of birds will return year after year to the same site that they've been. Now, you don't get a lot of redknots flying and stopping along the Oregon coast. The large amount of the redknot subspecies will fly directly to Grays Harbor or Willapa Bay, and from there, after roosting, they will spread out to those different places that are each little subflock's preferred place for foraging. My own personal favorite for seeing redknots in blooming breeding plumage that you see here is Bottle Beach on the south side of Grays Harbor. Conservationists there have done a marvelous job of establishing this beach as a viewing point and protected place for foraging migrants. Dogs are not allowed on the beach. They've done great educational work. There's a marvelous boardwalk through wetlands to get to the beach, and it's not the only place in Grays Harbor that you can see them, but May 12th is what I recommend, which is a little after the Grays Harbor Shorebird Festival. Those of you that have time and interest right now, if you are interested in helping with shorebird counts right now, there's one going on this weekend on the 15th and another one on December 15th in Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay, and also in the estuary, the mouth of the lower Columbia. And if you're interested in participating in that, go to pacificbirds.org for the schedule and finding a place to go do that. It's this concept of site fidelity where birds are going to known places on their migration where they will find food that is the source of this whole project, actually, and the next painting. Birds that spend their long summer, October through March or April, in New Zealand and Australia, and remnant populations of redknots on the east of the Indian subcontinent, all funnel on their migration through a very small 10-mile long coast piece of shoreline at the north coast of the Yellow Sea in China called Bohai Bay. They are coming here looking for a type of mollusk. It is not, they don't get dark chocolate here. We all know that the Chinese don't eat dark chocolate, but it is enough food and available enough, easy enough to find, easy enough to digest that they can meet their needs to regain body weight after migration and to have enough fuel to fly another 2,000 miles into the Russian Arctic. So this is an essential place, and Chinese conservationists and other conservationists from around the world have been doing marvelous work to educate Chinese planners about the needs of migrating birds. As you all know, China's in a great economic boom and developing its coast for industry and people, and since they believe in climate change, preparing for ocean level rise with plans that either has been done or is soon planned to put seawalls up on 25% of the Chinese coast. Now, a seawall destroys tidal mud flats and shorelines, so that there, yes, may be other shorelines where birds could go, but will there be food there, and will it be the type that red knots need? So shorebird biologist Lee Tibbetts asked me if I could use my skills of an artist 8 years ago to help do something that could help in public education about the needs of the shorebirds. And this site, Bohai Bay in China, was the critical site on the East Asian flyway. The East Coast, next slide, of the United States is an equally critical area because of the relationship that red knots have to horseshoe crabs. So back to the full moon here, red knots time their migration flights by celestial light cues, as we said, beginning on a full moon. Horseshoe crabs, who are also tied to the moon, come to shore on the high tides of the new and full moons, but they time their arrival on the shore relative to ocean temperature. This year, the Atlantic Ocean was cooler, and so red knots had actually come and gone from the Atlantic coast before the horseshoe crabs came in to spawn. The effects of that on the populations of red knots are not, I don't know what they are yet, but in the past, crashes of red knots have been tied to crashes of the horseshoe crab population on the East Coast. In Audubon's time, they were used for fertilizer and hog food. They are also used as a bait for other fish and whelks and kinds of food that will end up as in gourmet restaurants, and the biomedical industry, of course, is using them. There are 3 companies in the United States which extract horseshoe crab blood, possibly in sustainable amounts, and quite likely not. They take the horseshoe crabs and drain blood out of them, and then theoretically put them back in the ocean and say they're just little crabs, so they don't mind. But that is yet to be seen. European scientists have made the lysate toxin detector that is natural in horseshoe crab blood. They have synthesized an alternative, but that has not been approved by the FDA for use here in the production of, for example, COVID vaccine. So when you get around to the time when you get a COVID vaccine, remember to say thank you to the horseshoe crabs. And if you have a little extra money lying around at the time, you might want to consider a donation to the Horseshoe Crab Conservation Initiative, which started this year and is supported by Audubon and a variety of the conservation groups on the East Coast. So the bottleneck for the America's species of red knots on the East Coast may be horseshoe crabs in our relationship to do them. So, Besides horseshoe crabs, whenever you eat whenever you eat horseshoe crab, when you get your COVID vaccine and you ever eat dark chocolate or go to the full moon, remember red knots. Last slide. I'm going to leave you with this last slide. It is in the style of a great mural artist, a French Tunisian artist who works with Arabic calligraphy and therefore locates us in the mudflats of Tunisia. Some of the red knots that have spent their long summer or winter on the African coast will go up the coast of Africa and then jump up through the coast of Spain and France to Northern Europe. Others will decide to just take a little jump across the Sahara Desert and to the tidal flats in the north of Tunisia, from whence they'll make a jump across the Mediterranean to Northern Europe. I toyed in this painting with trying to learn Arabic, but quickly ascertained that my patience and skills were not up to the task, but I could write English backwards with an Arabic tilt to it. So this painting clearly says, in English letters written right to left and in 2 columns from top to bottom, says, red knots, godwits, shorebirds, humans, we travel together into our future. And that is because every effort to maintain tidal flats and wetlands for habitat for migrating birds is also benefiting humans. Wetlands are a major carbon sink that help us deal with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you all know that tidal flats and barrier islands protect us from storm surges of hurricanes and tsunamis and other natural events of that source. So we are together, we and the birds, and all conservation efforts from a group like yours for your particular habitat in Cannon Beach. But I know that your education of people there inspires them to work wherever they are in their place in the world. And so we're all connected in the effort. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to share these paintings with you. The next slide, if any of you want to learn more about the connection of horseshoe crabs and red knots, there's a marvelous book called The Narrow Edge, A Tiny Bird, an Ancient Crab, and an Epic Journey by Deborah Kramer, and a book for young adult readers called Moonbird by Philip Hoos is also an excellent book. Go to your local bookstore to acquire these. Don't do it from Amazon. But last slide. That's just my personal tidal flat restoration preference. If any of you want to see more slides or get more information about any of the paintings we have seen, you can go to my website, theredknotsproject.org. You can contact me via Gmail here. And if that tiny little painting, the image below of the birds migrating at night, that's been made into a holiday greeting card by the Syracuse Cultural Workers, a wonderful group of graphic designers back east that does lovely work. You could go to their website to order cards from them if you want. The message on the inside is, may your spirit soar during this holiday season. So if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Well, first off, I want to say thank you so much, Janet. That was fascinating. And I feel like I've been on a whole journey now.
You have.
With the red knots around the world. We did have a question from Amy who said, "This is very interesting. When I was a little girl, horseshoe crabs were common on the shoreline in Massachusetts. Now they are rare. How are they doing in the bay where the red knots are eating their eggs?"
Um, different years they're doing differently. It is known that horseshoe crabs are very important for migrating birds. It's known that Delaware Bay is an important beach habitat site for them. Historical records talk about thousands of eggs on the beach in sort of windrows from the tide. So if a horseshoe crab buries its eggs in the beach, but if in leaving the beach or other crabs coming in, their nests get disturbed, the eggs go up to the surface. And there's not as many of them as there were. In Audubon's time, there was a crash of horseshoe crabs, and similarly a crash of red knots that followed it. Audubon, interestingly, does not mention horseshoe crabs, and so maybe it was that the horseshoe crab nesting and eggs were so diminished during his time that the red knots were eating mussels and clams. Instead, the crash that I mentioned in Tierra del Fuego, where in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was huge flocks of flocks in 5,000, 6,000 birds in flocks in Tierra del Fuego, and that population crashed. It is likely because of the crash of horseshoe crabs, because of overharvesting for fishing bait, where people would come in and just, pile truckloads of them into their car and break them apart and use them in crab traps and whelk traps, and also for the biomedical industry. So conservationists have worked in Delaware along the bay specifically to get regulations so only so many crabs can be taken, and other places in the barrier islands of the Carolinas where only so many crabs can be taken, and places where they can't be taken and where they can enforce those regulations, there is better success for horseshoe crabs. Hannah, can you go back to the slide? It's 3 back. Go back up one more. Yeah, here. I forgot to mention this painting, which locates us in the barrier islands of South Carolina, is done in a contemporary quilting style of the Gullah Geechee people of the barrier islands of the Carolinas. These are the descendants of Africans trafficked by European slavers between the 15 and 1800s to the Americas. Now, the traditional West African agriculture, some of which I mentioned when we were in Ghana, these people the Africans were expert at growing rice along the coastline, and the plantation owners of the 1700s used that expertise for the Africans that were building fields for growing rice and maintaining the canals and the watering system necessary for water in the fields. The African people that were put on this forced migration to the Americas on the plantations, they would be divided up into miscellaneous groups, so they had no common language, and yet they developed a common language, Gullah, and common music and art traditions, one of which is this form of strip quilting, which is remnants of what they may have remembered in Africa of the strip weaving that was on that kente cloth. Now, as slaves on plantations, they would have just been making strip quilts out of tiny pieces of very faded material, what was left over from their clothes. But contemporary Gullah artists who have access to brightly colored new material are doing wonderful things with strip quilting. And if you ever get to see an exhibition of contemporary Gullah Geechee quilts, I highly recommend it. So birds migrate, people migrate, birds adapt, people adapt. And we all have really important choices to make about how we're all going to live on the planet together.
Okay, well, so Tim is asking for the picture of the book, so I'm going to move to that so he can check that title. And then Lee has a question. It says, very cool, Janet. What is the next painting going to be?
What's the next painting of red nuts going to be? When I made the website a couple of years ago, I thought that, well, I've got all the major sites of red knots. I've done something about the major sites of red knots around the world, so I'm okay. But if I just did 3 more paintings, I would really have it covered, and most of the important biology covered. And I've done 4 more paintings, and I still think I have 3 more to do. And they're getting more difficult as time goes on. That, for example, that painting of the gullah within the gullah strip quilts, I had been thinking about the Barrier Islands and the Gulf Coast of the Americas for 3 years, not understanding what kind of style of art I could use, that I could use. Now, there's lots of styles of art, but what I felt capable of translating into acrylic is a different question altogether. Similarly, it took me 3 years to figure out about the incised calabashes from the Bajagos archipelago. Their artwork is basically sculptural, and it just didn't fit very well into flat painting, and so it took a long time until eventually I found a picture of a calabash that was known to have come from the Bajagos archipelago, and it had a bird on it. So I'm very slowed down. I think there are places along the north coast of Europe, in Norway, that need doing. I think there are, on the inland route, from the birds that breed in the Tamar Peninsula of Russia and will go through northern Europe and down the coast of West Africa. Some of them are also coming sort of inland through Estonia and Latvia, just as there are still remnants of red knots that fly from Padre Island up the center of the United States, on the prairie pools of the United States to get to the Canadian Arctic, rather than going up the Atlantic coast. So those are 2 that are on my mind, and I think there's some more I need to do on the Atlantic coast of South America. So red knots are fascinating. You find out all sorts of things you never suspected were interesting in studying them. So who knows what comes next?
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of work ahead of you.
That was a good politician's answer, right? I didn't answer her question, and I talked a lot about other things.
So Tim already has this book on hold at the library. He just
Great.
Posted. But is there any additional reading that you can suggest?
Oh, well, there. Read anything you can about birds. There's so many good books. Where's the book? What's it called? I can't remember. I have a book about shorebirds written by an author in England who mentions a moonbird, one that was tracked for 20 years, that had come from South Africa, flying up to the Tamar Peninsula. You find references to red knots in all sorts of places. I found out reading about what was that Greenlandic Arctic explorers who crossed the Canadian Arctic by dog sled in the 1930s. You'll find references to the 1918 epidemic, and they're leading us to references to what we're doing now. So the whole world's connected, and there's wonderful scientific papers available in various places that are fascinating, and I recommend all of them.
Well, that's a great recommendation. Everything.
Yeah, everything. Read it. Read everything, and in books as if possible.
Well, it looks like our last question is from Julia, who said, "Are your paintings available in a book form?"
No, but if you know somebody who would like to publish them in a book form, please tell them to contact me.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Janet. And I'll put your last slide up here. So if anybody wants to get a hold of you, they'll have your contact information. And we appreciate you so much for coming out and joining us for our very first library lecture for this season. And we look forward to bringing you all another one next month. And thank you all for joining us. We are the Friends of Haystack Rock, and we are here to promote the preservation and protection of the intertidal life and birds that inhabit the marine garden and Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge at Haystack Rock. You all have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. So I think that was